and I know we've got some friends here who've been engaged in part of that journey. The theme has been unearthed, and we've been encouraging Hoosiers to discover and discuss their relationships with the natural world. We've been exploring through literature and film and scholarship some really big questions. Questions like, how do we shape our environment and how does it shape us? What does Hoosier environmental history reveal about the way we live today? One of my favorites, are we being good ancestors? In understanding our relationship to the environment, journalism can reveal these relationships and has been a really important part of this inquiry. Journalism can also uncover the structures of environmental racism, doing hard investigative work to discover and share what has been excluded by traditional historical and media narratives. That's why we're thrilled to have invited Vann Newkirk to Indianapolis this evening. Vann is a senior editor at The Atlantic and the host and co-creator of the 2021 Peabody Award-winning podcast, Floodlines. It's an 8-part narrative series about Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath. It was released in 2020. If you haven't listened to it, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's fantastic. Floodlines was also named the top podcast of 2020 by NPR, The New Yorker, and New York Magazine. For years, even though he's still a young man, he has covered voting rights, democracy, and environmental justice with a focus on how race and class shape the country and the world's fundamental structures. He was also a 2020 James Beard Award Finalist, a 2020 11th Hour Fellow at New America, and a 2018 recipient of the American Society of Magazine Editors ASME Next Award. I'm almost done with my early remarks because I know you're eager to get to Vann, but this evening we're going to hear remarks, then we're going to turn to a conversation where Rebecca Thiele will kick off the discussion. Now, I think when you came in, you got note cards. You're part of the conversation tonight, so after the moderated dialogue, we're going to be looking for your questions as well. So if you do have one, write it on the note card, and our team will be by to pick up your questions and make sure we get as many of them answered as we can. But before I close, I'd like to give a couple of really important thank yous, because none of these types of events happen without deep partnerships, and that's the way we work at Indiana Humanities. This program was made possible in partnership with WFYI, New America, and Indiana Public Broadcasting News. That's why some of you who aren't here physically with us can enjoy the conversation this evening. A big thanks to everyone at WFYI for their help in organizing and providing the live stream support. And also our deepest thanks to our friends at the Indianapolis Public Library for hosting us in their beautiful space this evening, as they often do. Thank you, our friends at the library. Finally, this program is part of the Democracy and the Informed Citizenship Initiative administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils. This initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and informed citizenry. We thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for their support and the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership. So thank you again to all of our wonderful partners and to all of you for being here tonight. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Vann R. Newkirk II.
Well, I don't know, the math says I'm kind of youngish, but
You are to me.
last night I put my son to bed and I could not get back up. So I don't know. The knees in the back, not that young anymore. First of all, I want to say thank you to Indiana Humanities and to WFYI for this event and for the invitation. And also to the Indianapolis Library. I love a good library, and I walked in the front door and, oh my God, wow. This place is awesome. I don't know if I have to do remarks or anything. I'm just glad to be in the building. Thank you to Becky for chatting with me, and I do apologize for reading these notes from my phone, but when I went to print them out this morning, I found coins jammed into the feeder slot in my printer. I believe my children wanted me to stay home. but I think I made it anyways, and I hope I'm not too bad. I won't be long because I much prefer to converse and to answer and ask questions of you in the audience. And I don't like to talk at people for a long time. Now, this may be a strange thing to hear from a podcast host who's talking about his podcast, but I really prefer to talk and to converse. Before we get started tonight, I do think it's important to acknowledge what's going on in the world, partly because it's deeply relevant to what we're here to talk about. The Supreme Court has decided that the right to abortion is no longer constitutionally protected. People are in the streets right now trying to scramble to challenge state trigger laws and still provide life-altering and life-saving procedures. I've been talking to people in Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Texas, who are making calculations and having to grapple with the status quo that we have not seen for generations. And all signs indicate that regarding abortion, we aren't just going back to 1972. We are in an era of hyper-surveillance, mass incarceration, and mass deportation that all ratchets up the danger of choosing abortion. The court has also signaled that this is only one move in an era of retrenchment. Voting rights for people of color have already been on the retreat, and the court seems inclined to strike federal protections of those rights down pretty soon, any day now. Trans folks are facing increasing discrimination and marginalization, often from a raft of new state policies, especially in the South. There are rumblings of challenges to same-sex marriage. And the court also seems disposed to limit some of the most effective tools the government has in addressing climate change and environmental injustice. To me, it is important not to think about these as discrete, separate issues or points. Rather, what we have is a large-scale reconsideration of all the ways that marginalized people in this country have been able to live and how, or if, our laws protect them. One piece of this puzzle is the environment, or the ways that we interact with our built or assigned surroundings. But it's important to understand that all the pieces of that puzzle are by nature connected. I know that, it's on the sign up there. We're here to talk about the Floodlines podcast. I'm glad for everybody for listening and giving me a shot. So I'll start there. Of course, the easiest way to describe that work is that it's a podcast about Hurricane Katrina. I never like to use that shorthand, though. To me, it's not a definitive story about a disaster event. I guess a more scholarly description might be Floodlines is about how historical and present-day marginalization of poor Black communities played a role in the outcomes of a human-created catastrophe. Now, that's a mouthful. I don't want to say it again. But to me, it's also about environmental justice, which is obviously what we're going to talk about today. But to me, it's also about music. It's about candy. It's about the sounds and eats of a town. It's about second lines and neighborhoods and a Black girl navigating a transition into adulthood. It's a story about stories and about the people and communities who make those stories. To me, you cannot understand those people and stories by siloing things into specific concepts. You can't understand America without studying New Orleans, from Plessy v. Ferguson to Ruby Bridges integrating schools, Hurricane Katrina. You can't understand New Orleans today without understanding the slave history of that city. You can't understand the environmental inequalities of a flood without understanding historic patterns of redlining, of development, segregation, and without understanding the nature of our current day wealth gaps. You can't understand the stories of a Leanne or an Alice without understanding how Black women have held Black communities together and how they have been expressly targeted by those who wish to see those communities fall apart. As a journalist whose beat might be loosely defined as quote unquote justice, my job is a synthesis of these. It doesn't require any special skills, and I assure you, I have no special skills. Like, not at all. All it takes is a commitment to listening, a commitment to listening and paying attention and to amplifying people and sources of information that have not traditionally been deemed important. The voices of people from places on the margins, the voices of the ancestors, and of histories outside of the big books. It means reconsidering what we in the field believe to be expertise. It means questioning in conventional wisdom and learning from indigenous wisdom, from the wisdom of those enslaved, those gendered and racialized as other. I hope we were able to do a little bit of that with Floodlines. I hope I've been able to do some of that with my work. I'm not sure if I've met this moment or if I've even fully lived up professionally to the practices and ideals that I outlined here. But I do think that a commitment to storytelling from below and from outside the axes that we traditionally value in our journalistic outlets is the only way for us to win in a warming world, in a world where racial hegemony is still in the advance, and in a world where our existing structures do and will funnel the material challenges of climate change to those who have already been oppressed. We're going to talk about environmental justice. That's what we're talking about. And I hope that we can talk a little bit about that commitment to those principles and that work, and we can get right to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vann, for those much-needed comments this evening. My name is Megan Tulligman. I'm Director of Programs at Indiana Humanities, and I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Rebecca Thiele. Rebecca is the Energy and Environment Reporter for the Indianapolis Public Broadcasting, a collaboration of public radio and TV stations around the state. Though she covers several environmental issues in Indiana, she's particularly passionate about community pollution stories. That includes covering industrial chemicals linked to child cancers in Franklin, coal ash cleanup in Michigan City, and ongoing coverage of the lead and arsenic-contaminated soil in East Chicago. Rebecca is currently working on a project answering audience questions about climate change and climate solutions. So now I'm going to welcome Rebecca and Vann to the stage for the conversation this evening. Thanks.
I don't have an excuse like Vann. I just like reading off my phone, or really all notes. So, Vann, I think that you laid out a really good primer for us for Floodlines. But, specifically, I want you to talk a little bit more about how you made the actual story. You follow a lot of different people throughout this aftermath. Why did you decide to choose to tell it that way? And how did you choose whose stories to tell?
So I think there's a couple ways you can go about doing a documentary, a piece of nonfiction work about an event. You can aim to be definitive. You can aim to do the exhaustive, that's the Ken Burns thing, I think. You can aim to create something that is going to be a forever educational resource in this monolithic way. We didn't have the money to do that. But what we did have, the resources, the time, the ability to do, and I think in a way that added value to our understanding of this event, was we could choose to talk to people who had not been prioritized before and try to honor their stories. So as we started doing this, as we started going on the road and interviewing people, I wanted to talk to people. I think what you'll find with Katrina is you have a lot of people have told their story to media. And a lot of people are tired of telling their story to media. You go in and you're asking people about the worst day in their lives over and over again. So what we tried to do is to kind of break the mold there and to ask people themselves, what were their unresolved questions about Katrina? And how might we assist in answering those questions? So I think when we started asking that, it became clear what our prioritized interviews were going to be, who the people were going to hang around with. They were the people with the most unanswered questions, people who still had processing to do about this event in their lives. And I think for us, it was a journey together.
That must have been really difficult for you to go into a situation where the media has gotten so many things wrong and trying to say, no, we're really going to try and do it right this time. You know, what was that like for you?
Well, you know, I want to have the disclaimer here. I'm not sure we did it right. I think we did it to the best of our ability. And of course, we were informed by decades of criticism, of media critique of specifically Katrina. And we were aided by organizations like the Dart Center at Columbia, which was founded specifically by people who covered Katrina, kind of to get around some of the pitfalls that people encountered during that reporting. Once you have all that foregrounding out the way, I think, you know, I was looking for people who would, for documentaries, for podcasts specifically that I had worked with an approach from all that research, from all the people who were doing correctives. And I felt like the road was wide enough open for us to contribute something new. But it did take, you know, what you're asking people to do, we were asking ourselves to do, was to go against some of the existing priors of journalism, to go against our own training, to deal with trauma in a way that you're often told goes against journalistic ethics, and to create something that felt uncomfortable to make. So it was difficult.
Right, and you know, they're reliving it when you start talking about it too.
Right, they're reliving it, and sitting with people in that discomfort, and also ensuring people and talking to them about, we're not just extracting this from you. We are here together. If there are moments when you don't want us to record, we want you to have a level of autonomy and true informed consent about what this interview is, what we use it for, and what we are doing. So we want to make sure even though we're talking again about the worst day of your life, I want to make sure you're comfortable, that you're okay with it. That you're not doing it because you have somebody in your house at your door and with a microphone in your face. That you're doing it because you think there's value in doing it. And again, that took a lot of rethinking, a lot of getting over my own ego, a lot of what I've been trained to do.
So talk a little bit about the 24-hour news cycle and how that played into Katrina, and how do we see that today?
Yeah, so one of the things that has always drawn me to Katrina as an event is it is really our first domestic event in the 24-hour news cycle after the war, after we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. So we had a lot of structures that had been built to cover pretty much one event exclusively, to go and cover, up until that point, kind of a triumphant narrative of America winning overseas of war. And as a kid, I was a teenager when Katrina happened, and I don't think I realized how much my perception of what happened was shaped by the priors and priorities of that news system. We had reporters, we had structures, we had even ways of framing and showing shots from above, from helicopters, that the only thing they were good at doing was creating a narrative out of a war. And so they came and did the same thing. You know, I think what people latched on early from both sides, both from the creation side and from the critique side, was, say, the stories about people looting, right? You had these really sensationalized images of people running out of supermarkets carrying TVs or Jordans. And what we found in Floodlines is that's like 5 images they kept replaying over and over again and made it look like there were thousands of people going in. But I think even that back and forth kind of missed the point, which is that we only know how to make a narrative out of dysfunction. And there were no ways to show people engaging in solidarity. There were no ways to show people, or the ways that our government failed people in real ways. And I think it was essentially we're still looking at an ecosystem that's only built to do certain things well. And I think we're roared back into shape now with the war in Ukraine, for example. But I still think it's not a really good media ecosystem for dealing with the long hand of oppression, say, in society, or for more nuanced issues of policy and well-being, and what happens when communities actually like each other. We don't get a whole lot of that.
Well, and everything has to happen so quickly. It's harder to get that long, rich story with so much nuance.
Right. You don't get, the priorities, the incentives of news making today, obviously we have to make money. And unfortunately, the best way to make money is to show or create a narrative of not just people hurting one another, but of people hurting one another in ways that fit our existing stereotypes. So what happened during Katrina was the thing that we knew got eyeballs on the news was these stories of mostly black citizens of New Orleans behaving in ways that felt to transgress what it was like to be human, and to create a narrative that they were descending into a certain level of almost animalistic behavior. And what we know now from studies of that time, from people who were, we had stories about people sniping at helicopters and at ambulances. We had stories of just massive gang violence in places like the convention center, of this just incredibly deteriorating atmosphere of human behavior on the ground. And we know a lot of those incidents now, in hindsight, were just not true. It never happened. So that was actually, I think I thought that I knew the extent to which these things had been, if not fabricated, sort of hyped up. But actually, I had no idea.
Yeah, and then, in doing that, in sort of dehumanizing the people of New Orleans, we then saw less relief.
Right. These things had material impacts on the level of support, of aid, even, during the teeth of the crisis and down the road, that people were able to get from nonprofits, from people who, good-minded citizens, and from the government. For example, we know that the Red Cross did not respond as quickly because of incidents of violence that turned out not to be true. They thought it was too dangerous. We know that first responders from police and from the National Guard held back, or instead of going to help people, trained their guns on people because they believed they were violent and unsavable. We had real incidents where people were killed by vigilantes who were buying wholesale the narrative that came first out of the news. So we know that this wasn't just a thing where people got mad at racism, in the news. It was a thing where we got to understand that racism, that these narratives actually changed the trajectory of how people were helped or were not helped.
There's a moment that I think of a lot in Floodlines, and probably because I am part of NPR affiliates, but there's a moment where Robert Siegel is interviewing the Secretary of Homeland Security, and he's asking him about the convention center and the really terrible conditions there. People didn't have water, they didn't have enough food, and the secretary is denying this. And then they quickly go to a reporter on the ground who said, we just came from there.
Yeah.
And this is not true. I feel like that says so much about journalism and about accountability in that moment. What did that mean to you? How do you feel about it?
Well, first of all, for a gotcha like that to work in real time, shout out to the producers. We don't talk enough about producers, but that was virtuoso stuff. But really, I don't mean to come into this totally down about the media because, spoiler alert, I'm in the media. So I think that was an incredibly brave moment. It was a moment where it would have been easy for them to sort of back off on this, to give Homeland some space, to demur a little bit and say, oh, that's not what we had, but you may have different information. Instead, they directly challenged Michael Chertoff about what he knew, about what the official narrative was, and then immediately presented, they knew what they had, they knew what they were going to get. They had to in order to set that up. So they had to choose in advance to do something that, I think, especially look back at the media landscape in 2005, directly challenging a member of the administration like that. It was not a risk-free adventure. There was real risk involved in this for them, and they did it. And so I think, as much as I am down on the overall media picture, there were people, there were organizations, there were outlets that chose to that chose to go against their own priors, that chose to go against their own incentives of the industry to present a more complete picture. And that's the only way we know now.
I'm kind of going to switch gears just a little bit. You have a phrase that sometimes climate activists use that you're not completely fond of, and it's, we're all in this together. Can you explain why?
Oh, well, we're not, number one. I think I understand the meaning there and what the phrase is trying to do. You're trying to loop in people who might not care about climate change, who are used to not having to care about things because they don't happen to them. And you're trying to get them to say, oh, wait, the thermostat is going up for everybody, which is true to an extent. But I think our ongoing experience of how, this is not our first rodeo with a changing climate. It's not our first rodeo with catastrophe. We know almost the entire record of disasters, of major events in human history shows that unless you're dealing with something like a meteor, I guess, that's just going to kill everybody, we know that events tend to amplify the dysfunctions of our human structures. So you think about previous hurricanes. You think about Katrina, obviously, but you look at Hurricane Betsy. You look at the Lake Okeechobee hurricane in 1928 in Florida. That hurricane killed maybe thousands of black people and killed something on the order of 12 white people. We understand those are not coincidences. We understand that those are reflections of our built environment, of our politics. We know that they killed so many black people because they were not allowed to live in standard housing. They lived in shanties. We know that that was the case for most hurricanes until the 21st century. We understand that the levers of climate change are going to be these type of disasters. They're going to be floods. They're going to be hurricanes. They're going to be major storms. They're going to be forest fires and droughts and famines. And we know every single drought, famine, every forest fire, every hurricane in almost in existence, we know who they have affected the most. We know who heat affects the most today. We know that the people who are most likely to have to work outside in the heat with no air conditioning, who are those in the world? It's 2 billion most poor people in the world. It's agricultural laborers. It's people who work in sweatshops. So for you to tell me we're all in this together, when you're talking about a warming world, that's just empirically untrue.
And, you can also say about rebuilding after some of these disasters. You said that it was a very different reality for some of these communities and their ability to rebuild after Katrina.
Well, a couple of studies have really changed, my perspective and have pushed me a lot. And they were done in the wake of Hurricane Katrina especially, but other disasters in America since then. And there's a body of research now showing that for wealthy, particularly wealthy white Americans and upper middle class white Americans who go through a disaster, they actually increase their wealth in the years after that disaster. That's due to a lot of different things. It's due to having adequate FEMA support, having insurance. For those people who, especially people in older housing, it's kind of like they get a blank slate. They get the resources they need to rebuild, and now they have a tabula rasa on which to improve their lives. And we know that for especially poor people of color, they get wiped out. They lose money over time. So what do you call that aside from a wealth transfer from low to high? So we know, and this is, again, based on our understanding of Katrina, what happened there, rebuilding is not just inequitable, it actually pulls money from our poorest communities of color and gives it to the people who have the most power. That's, again, it's not just an inequality, it's an actual siphoning.
And you mentioned air conditioning. And here in Indiana, obviously, we don't have hurricanes. But we do have a lot of issues with heat.
Yeah, it's hot out here.
We're not, like the humidity, it's just for you. So, this isn't something where I think that a lot of people have this idea that, well, climate change is happening on the coast, but we're seeing it everywhere, and we're also seeing the inequality everywhere. Can you talk a little bit about what are those commonalities that we can see between the inequalities in Katrina and the inequalities that folks might see here?
Well, I mean, I walked across a couple of lawns today, and it hasn't rained here in a while, has it? I think that's one big thing. It's one thing that I think about a lot is one of the fundamental things about American life the last 50 years that we take so much for granted is widespread access to fresh water. We're not going to be able to take that for granted in the next generation, and that's going to happen inland. That's a major problem that's happening in lots of agricultural production centers now. And I think Indiana has a lot of agriculture, right? It's a big problem. It's going to be irrigation is going to be a major problem. We're already trying to figure out whether major agricultural centers in the United States are going to be irrigating their fields with recycled fracking water, for example. We don't know what it's going to do. And we don't know what's going to do to the workers who are doused with it. But now we're already having to make those decisions. You look at California, places in California that are inland. This fall, this winter, we're talking about an unprecedented crisis in access to water for farms. And this is true of lots of inland agricultural areas. So that's a big thing. I think a lot of the news about fires, forest fires, has been kind of concentrated to the West Coast, to Washington, to Oregon, to California, but forest fires are increasing rapidly in pretty much every state where there are forests. And we know that those are also present a justice issue. We know that, again, in rebuilding, the people that are able to rebuild the fastest are those who already have access to capital. I think a lot about disease. We just live in a world now where it's accepted that Lyme disease is, you can contract Lyme disease in Georgia, that you can get West Nile disease in New York. And those are things that were not true when I was born. And those are things that are driven by insect vectors that are spread by climate change, and again, affect those who are not going to have access to insurance and who are going to be in substandard housing. So I think, this is not a job for people who don't like to worry, unfortunately.
Going back a little bit to New Orleans, obviously one of the biggest things was the levees and how that really devastated those communities. We can't do much about, well, let's see how to phrase this. There's only so much we can do once the CO2 is in the air, once we're experiencing the climate that we're experiencing. But once that happens, there are things that we can do about infrastructure that right now sometimes we simply aren't doing. You know, how do you feel like that also plays into this inequity?
Yeah, well, like you said, I think, essentially, we're not talking about simply using mitigation strategies to deal with climate change. I mean, some levels baked in for the future, and the climate has already changed. And we already have to think about ways to leverage our infrastructure to deal with it. And the problem with infrastructure globally, but all pretty specifically in America, is it is so hyper-local in how we finance it, in how we think about who it serves, and in how we maintain it. So that was actually a major problem with the levees in New Orleans. You look at one of the major problems in how the levees were maintained is there are a bunch of different levee districts, and they all couldn't figure out how to work together to maintain the levees. Now you'd think, you have a bunch of levees that kind of control the biggest body of water in the continent, might have a little bit more coordination, but we didn't. And those levees were sort of, they were remarkable because they do have a great deal of federal funding behind them. They had the Army Corps of Engineers build them, but there's so many smaller levee projects, so many smaller pieces of climate infrastructure that are solely based on local tax collection. And so you can imagine if a place goes through a bad bit of tax revenue time, they can't afford to protect themselves. And you all, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse. You know what places are going to be most likely to have those type of shortfalls. So you look at things like local creek, ditches, water management systems. You have a bad year, and I've been working on a book kind of about this for Black towns. A lot of Black towns have always had budget shortfalls precisely because of discrimination. How do they maintain their life-saving systems in a world where they're having more and more climate pressures placed on them? So yeah, it's a big deal. The levees in New Orleans are, one of a kind. They are world-class buildings. You can see them, the wall now that was built to upgrade them from space. But there are so many places that don't have that level of federal commitment that we've kind of just consigned to catastrophe in the near future.
Well, and the infrastructure law is something that we're seeing, communities start to put into place. But even then, we're seeing some communities decide, we're just going to fix what we want to fix. And we're not necessarily going to take it the extra mile to account for climate.
Well, on some level, you can't blame them. You've got a lot of people, a lot of communities that did have real budget constraints, and now they get a bunch of money, and they're telling me I got to use that to fix the roads. Maybe we're going to pay the police. Maybe we're going to fix the roads a little bit and use the windfall from the rest of the budget to pay the police. I think the examples of levees is a very critical one here, because if you've got 17 communities on a river that passes through 2 states, right? Each levee you place on that river is going to increase the amount of water that gets shunted downstream, increases the pressure on the next levee. But if there's no incentive for those communities to work together on those systems, that 17th community is out of luck. So you have to think, that's how we have to think about any climate system, is a system. There is no way you can individually build infrastructure to get your way out of this crisis. And in many ways, individual action or action to save individual communities can actively harm other communities around them. And so, I think while the infrastructure package, a package of money is helpful for those places, climate change requires a coordinated response, and we are not there
I'm going to go to an audience question here. What tips do you have for telling effective stories about climate change, especially in communities like rural Indiana that may not widely believe it's happening?
That's a good question. What I try to do is I try to meet people where they're at, and especially I'm from rural North Carolina. I know a lot of folks back home who I tell them what I'm doing. And number one, they don't know what the Atlantic is. I think I write for Atlanta Magazine, or now The Athletic. And I tell them, I'm writing about climate change, and their eyes kind of glaze over. But as a rural person, I know most of their concerns are environmental. They may not be thinking about 2 degrees or 1.5 or maybe 2.5 in the future, but they are thinking about what happens to their favorite hunting and fishing grounds. They're talking about, they don't like pollution to those places. They don't like, back home, people love magnolia trees. They love live oaks. They love going into a place and having it be as inviolate as it was for their grandparents and their ancestors. And I think when I can start to connect with people on that level, I like to go fishing for striped bass in the Roanoke River. And if I'm talking to fishermen about how, they got smaller. They used to you could get a striper that was 4 feet long. You just go and drop your rod, your bait in the river, and you go home and you feed a whole family. You can't do that anymore. And I think if you can connect with people on those type of stories, on the things that matter to them, and I think a lot of sort of the criticism of coastal elites or whatever is overblown, but I do think that's one salient critique that matters, is you have a journalistic class of people that do not have those type of connections, that do not know how to talk to people who are tied to the land, who have a different set of priorities. And I think you have to recruit people from those communities to make those connections.
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned farmers earlier, because that's a wonderful example. Farmers are out there every single day.
Yeah.
They know exactly what's happening. And, I've certainly talked with farmers who, they won't say the words climate change, but we all know what we're talking about. And they can see the changes happening. And, there are a good portion of them who are saying, I know that I need to do something for me, if not for society at large.
Yeah, and once you connect on that level, I think you really are surprised, especially with farmers. And actually, I think farmers are a really good sort of group who can kind of lead the way. When they have a set of solutions that are actually practicable for them and can work for them, when they, there's a lot of now investment in, say, battery-operated farm equipment and tractors that don't run on battery-powered tractors, electric tractors, electric combines. And there are places that have played around with subsidies for these equipment. And, farming is a pretty heavily subsidized industry. When you can divert subsidies for those type of programs, farmers are behind it. They love it. Number one, you give them more money. But also, to be a farmer today, you have to be an early adapter. And many of them are.
Yeah. Well, and there is a big push right now to get more funding for those programs that really help farmers sustain themselves rather than, cash crops.
Right,
Things like that.
Yeah, and again, I don't think farmers are going around telling you that they just love soybeans. They grow what is profitable, and that's largely controlled by the federal government. Yeah.
I'm going to go to another audience question here. How was still writing and creating during the pandemic? How has your process of reporting and journalism shifted as we've seen such intense level of Black death these last 2 years?
Oh, that's a hell of a question. It's a hard one. So the answer involves Floodlines. So we released Floodlines on March 13th, 2020. So actually that last day, I had to record a bunch of pickups, do a lot of narration and writing, sort of just, we wanted to release them that night. And so I was in the studio all day with my phone off. I came out and turned my phone on, and oh my God, I thought the sky, I didn't think the sky had fell. The sky had fallen. First of all, I saw Tom Hanks had COVID. I saw the NBA, if you follow the NBA, that was the day Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell found out they had COVID. The day the NBA canceled all the rest of the games. Most sports leagues followed suit in the next couple hours. That was the day we were talking about at the World Health Organization whether we're going to call it a pandemic or not, and the day most offices, including mine, decided to pause or go on lockdown for a little while. So we put Floodlines out that night, and I was like, well, nobody's going to listen to it, but we gave it a good shot. We were in a fully new era, and I think we were very fortunate that people found some value there. But that next day, I was supposed to go take a couple months off, take a vacation. I planned to go fishing, and I went to the coronavirus beat. I covered COVID in Black communities, especially from March 14th on. And you want to talk about burnout? Oh my God. I was not just burnout, it was trying to deal with this you're trying to hold this catastrophe in your hands. And I was specifically reporting on why it was early in that pandemic and why it is still now. The people who were most likely to die were the elders in my community. And the first community I talked to was the family of Ronald Lewis, who we interviewed for Floodlines, who was a curator and founder of the House of Dancing Feathers in New Orleans. And he died from COVID in May of 2020. So I was sort of catapulted directly into it. And for my own mental health purposes, I had to kind of ease off on it, had to go back and take care of my parents who got ill. My mother passed away from breast cancer in that time. So for me, the specter of Black death has just been over my shoulders, and I've been thinking about it. And I don't have a good answer because I don't think I'm there yet. I don't think I have not answered it yet for myself. And obviously, it's still ongoing. We're not out of this thing yet. Black folks are still dying at disproportionate rates at younger ages than anyone else. So if you have the answer, or if you ask a question and want to jam more about it, you can butt me up after this, but I don't really have much more.
At what point did you go back to environmental justice reporting?
So again, I think in my remarks earlier, I think of environmental justice reporting not as a specific beat that I return to, but as part of a menu of things that I cover, to put a spotlight on this issue of justice. So for me, as the major issues of the pandemic, I think became not less urgent, but there were more people covering them. We knew more about it. It became clear that the pandemic was interacting with existing environmental injustices in our society. So one of those was heat. One of those was the widespread effects of particulate matter in raising asthma rates. And the big one that we find is how our built environments contribute to kidney disease. And we know now that kidney disorders are a major comorbidity for COVID deaths. And, maybe the most extreme health disparity we have in America is a disparity in kidney disease.
Can you unpack that a little bit, the built environment and kidney disease?
Yeah, so heat, one of the major contributors to kidney disease is exposure to heat. So we know that farm workers, the people who work outdoors, mechanics, people who work in places with no air conditioning, they are much more likely to suffer kidney disease because they're dehydrated chronically. And that is, if it's acute, you recover, you go on about your life. But if you work every day in this and your kidneys are damaged over time, it is a very fast and easy way to die. Over time, it is a very fast and easy way to die. And so end-stage renal disorders are what you call it when your kidneys are permanently damaged from these kind of chronic exposures to bad things. And we've seen them increase in the past couple decades of climate change. We've seen them specifically increase in Latino and Black communities. So you have that ground that's already set there, and for some reason, I don't know if we have a full understanding yet, but the people who seem to be most likely, most vulnerable for COVID deaths are those with damaged kidneys. We don't know exactly why, but it's a big issue. So you already have the ground watered and fertile for, again, an ongoing racial injustice.
You draw some parallels between Katrina and the Mississippi River flood of 1927, and can you talk a little bit about the coverage of those floods and how they intersect?
Yeah, 27 is an important thing for me. Number one, I get to talk about Mississippi, which is where my mother's family's from. I love the Delta, and I'll talk about it any chance I get. But the reason why that particular event sticks out in my imagination, in my storytelling imagination, is because if you want to talk about environmental justice or racism, whichever one you want to talk about, if you go back and look at specifically how, I don't want to give a history lesson here, but essentially the communities in the Delta, Mississippi Delta, and in Louisiana that were affected most by this flood in 1927, they were Black communities. They were sharecropping communities. And big white landowners saw in this disaster an opportunity to basically reestablish a status quo, pre-antebellum status quo, which was to impress a bunch of these people into involuntary service on their farms and to keep them from escaping, which they had been doing by the thousands, from escaping the sharecropping system. And so the Red Cross was actually enlisted in these labor camps in making these people re-engage in slave labor, and they literally had to carry passes around to go around at night. And it's been a story in my family. Lots of families in the Delta will talk about this. And where the media comes into it is we actually would have known none of that. None of that about impressment, none about having to carry passes to go from places to place, none about being involved in slave labor, none about having to go and actually use their physical bodies as levees when the levees broke. We would have known none of that if it weren't for the Black press. So one of the earliest missions for the NAACP south of the Mason-Dixon line was they sent their president. They sent the president down to cover it. This is, W.E. Du Bois was making early appeals in the crisis for people to look at what was going on. And actually, the president of the U.S. tried to suppress reports of what was happening in these camps. And not the president, actually, forget which department he led. I think it was the Interior, Herbert Hoover, who ended up becoming president. He tried to suppress the reports of what was happening in these camps so he could be elected as president. And so we wouldn't have known if it weren't for enterprising, intrepid Black reporters who chose to brave, physical harm and threats to their reputation and actually threats to being lynched to go and tell the truth. And so I think I carry that with us today. We don't know what in a lot of disasters what's happening if it's not for people who risk their own safety to tell the truth.
Now, of course, today, unfortunately, a lot of Black newspapers have shut down. Not the Indianapolis Recorder, they're still around.
Yes.
Shout out.
Shout out.
But you know, that does leave a gap. But you say we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. You know, what do you mean by that, and what does community-owned journalism, what could that look like today?
A lot of journalistic outlets are trying to figure out, you know, how do we make news that is, how do we get past this disinformation crisis today? And there's lots of wacky, wonky models out there, lots of, you know, really weird ideas. To me, you know, I think the easiest idea is to go back to what worked in the past. It's to invest, to reinvest, to in these local outlets, the ones that still exist currently, in Black press that still exists currently, and in people who are trying to revitalize the ones that may have had to fold in the past. And one thing about these Black newspapers that's important, a lot of them are intimately tied to or actually explicitly organized as community responsive institutions. So what that means is a lot of them actually are, you know, their shareholders are members of their communities. Or, you know, a lot of them are actually publicly financed now. And so I think we're talking about ways to better the information hygiene of Americans because it's terrible right now. And I think, you know, we go back to what worked in the past. We have so many instances of Black, of minority, of even, you know, of LGBT newspapers and publications that told the truth, but nobody else did. What is that but a disinformation crisis? You think about the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, in which the only institution to accurately report on a coup, the only coup on American soil, so it goes, of a multiracial government in Wilmington by a white supremacist government. The only outlets that cover that accurately, the only outlets that were up to that point covering the fact that there was no crisis of Black men sexually assaulting white women as far as lynching went, those were the places that were burned down to the ground. What is that but disinformation? We're not dealing with a new problem today. We're dealing with the oldest problem in America. And so I think, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel.
I'm going to read a couple of questions here. Can you discuss potential journalistic practices that might help unseat citizens from their disbeliefs in science-related matters, COVID, climate change, et cetera?
I tried to take a stab at that, I think, earlier. Look, I don't want to put forward any solutions and act like I know they're gonna work, because this is a hard question. And again, you know, I think to put forward any solution, you have to recognize the fact that disinformation, which again is what we're talking about, is our oldest problem, and we have not yet solved it, and it has created lots of very big problems in the past. But I do think the more that we can make journalism more tangible and closer to how people live, outside the big cities, outside of New York, outside of DC, the better chance we have of doing that. And I think really what we have to do, people, it's not just people being set in their ways or not wanting to listen to what's in front of them. They're actively absorbing information from people who are very good at reaching them directly. And, you know, I think we have to learn from those folks, from the people who are getting, you know, news delivered directly, not news, but who are getting something delivered by YouTube. Why are they so good at that? It's not just because they tell you what you want to hear, because they're actually very good at delivering that information or that misinformation. They've learned to leverage these networks in a way that I think, especially legacy journalistic organizations, have long thought sort of beneath them. So I think we're in an era now where we have to learn how to be more nimble. We have to learn how to use those tools to our advantage.
Yeah, there was another question that came in previously talking about how this Katrina happened before before we really had a concept of fake news, even if it was out there in the world, you know, can you imagine what that would have been like?
Oh,
if
so
we
actually,
had had that? Yeah.
I do think there was, we learned a lot about fake news during Katrina, unfortunately. And one of the incidents that, you know, really, it just did a number on me when I learned about how it happened. There were a group of vigilantes in a suburb who saw a bunch of, who over the course of that week after the flood, saw a bunch of black passersby who were trying to escape and shot a lot of them, just with shotguns, shot them. And it turns out that they had been influenced by none other than David Duke, yeah, who had a little blog. And David Duke was actually among the group of far-right provocateurs who were using the news coming out of the, you know, the traditional mainstream outlets to say there was a crisis of black brutality, of black animalistic behavior, and that these white people, this was, you know, a lot of people use the terminology now about the storm. This was the storm, and they had to defend themselves. And that's what those folks who were shooting people, that's what they were responding to. Actually, some of the people now that we consider to be the main, you know, places or the early pioneers in fake news, a lot of them got their start in Hurricane Katrina. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you think the lack of education on climate change and environmental problems in lower income communities is part of the reason they continue to be more affected by these problems?
So I think I would expand that, because for me, education is always a difficult, you know, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I would say information. I think there is a major information gap in this country, and it's not just between, you know, people who don't care about climate change and people who care. It really is between communities that would very well move to save themselves from a climate catastrophe, but don't have the information to do it. And between, you know, there's wealthy communities who do have the information, who do have the experts who are willing to come in to town and consult for free about building a seawall, who do it and get it done, and they're good. You know, there's not a whole lot of people who wanted to go do pro bono engineering work in Duck Hill, Mississippi. Not a whole lot of people who want to go do that in Kinston, North Carolina. And I think part of that is education, but it's a larger information deficit from people who need it, who don't have access to it. So it's expertise. It's, you know, people know that climate change exists, but they don't know about, you know, how different industries contribute to it. They don't know about how sea level rise contributes to the average flood stage of their local rivers. They don't have a lot of, you know, there's simple things like if you live in a poor town, you're less likely to have access to your own land records. You know, poor counties are notorious for not having complete deeds in their local land offices and their county registrars. You need that stuff. You need your blueprints in order to create infrastructure. And so I think it's a larger deficit of information.
Yeah, and there was a related question about, you know, how can we center the lived experiences of impacted communities to survive the climate crisis, and what's the best way to get the word out to Black communities about the importance of that topic?
So the reason I do what I do, and the reason I'm working on a book about 3 of the oldest Black towns in America and how they're all being destroyed by climate change and how they are emblematic of what's happening in Black towns writ large in America, is because I believe not only are they on the front line of climate change, not only are Black Americans, not only people of color, people on the margins, you know, literally on the margins of society, they're the first people who are going to get this coming to them, They're also the people who are engaging in, by necessity, the kinds of life and community-saving interventions that we have to learn as a country to fight this ourselves as a country. So, again, I mentioned Duck Hill, Mississippi. I thought to people in Duck Hill, it's a small town about an hour and a half north of Jackson. They got a very nice tire shop there and not a whole lot of other things, but great tires. But, and it's a town that, if you look in the Wikipedia for Duck Hill, Mississippi, the main entry in the Wikipedia is they were a town where there was a gruesome lynching of an African American during Jim Crow. That's about it. But the black folks there, by virtue of, they had to do this on their own. They're in Mississippi. Their state government does not care about climate change, not engage in any intervention whatsoever. But they kept flooding. And it wasn't just, catastrophic. It wasn't just flooding from hurricanes. They were flooding on sunny days. And they had to figure out how to deal with this flooding before it wiped away their town history. And they worked to get micro grants and worked to go and seek expertise from the people who were willing to give it to them. And they were, went out to the libraries and were going and looking at the blueprints for the seawall in the Netherlands. They're just really out there in these really intense sort of self-initiated interventions. And they built, using the labor of high schoolers from the area, built their own levees and have not had a sunny day flood since. So I think, if number one, if we're talking just about the level, what it takes to do this thing, if we're looking for optimism about the fact that we can do it, you can't do any better than going to a place like that and finding, their will, their gumption, their can do it. To say, okay, if they can do it, there's no way that a country that can, spin up billions of dollars for a war out of nowhere can't figure out how to do this thing. So I think, both on a practical level and sort of a level of understanding the will, we have to be listening to the communities, and we also have to be assisting them.
Yeah, and I think that maybe it's not necessarily just not knowing the impacts, because, that community, they feel it. It's not a mystery. It's knowing that those resources are out there. It's knowing that they actually can use those to make it happen.
Right. Well, it's knowing that they can use them, but also I think it should help us all free ourselves from the paralysis that thinking about climate change can induce, right? It's such a big problem. It quite literally is in many aspects the end of the world. And how do I fight against the end of the world? And I think if you see people who are getting a micro grant to build a levee, okay, you throw enough pebbles in the creek and it changes the way the creek is moving. So I think we have to have those examples though, of people who are quite literally fighting against the odds, because what we're all doing as a country, we're fighting against the odds.
Yeah, and on that note, given the state of the environment, the climate, and systemic racial injustice, where do you find hope for the future?
Well, I think the answer follows from the last answer. This book work especially, one of the towns that I've been fascinated with, and now have the great pleasure of being able to go and talk to people who have been there, who have history there, who are working there, who live there for their entire lives. It's the town of Princeville, North Carolina, which is 8 miles down the river from where I grew up in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and it is the first town incorporated by black people in this country. And they have had, they were built on, to say they were built on a floodplain, it doesn't do it justice. They were built on a bend where the river should be, where the Tar River should be. And they have dealt with flood after flood from generation to generation. Most recently in 2016 in 1999, they were devastated, completely destroyed by Hurricanes Matthew and Hurricane Floyd. And each time they have chosen to come back. They chose to build a town in a place nobody else wanted And they have kept and held that town for a century and a half. And they've done it with no help from, obviously no help from the Jim Crow government, from white people around them, from the federal government until the 1960s. They did it and they built it 2 years after it was illegal for the people there to even read or write. You talk about doing the impossible. There's nothing that we're facing now that's as impossible as that. So to me, I think, look, if they can do it, they can hold it. Number one, we owe them as a country. They've carried that burden long enough. Now we owe it to them to come and aid with them and act in solidarity. But also we can learn from them. If they've been able to do that, what we're facing right now is almost trivial.
There's some people who I've heard say, well, New Orleans has, it's below the sea level. Why would you choose to stay in a place like that? I've also, talked with folks in East Chicago where the Superfund site is. They're dealing with lead and arsenic. And, a lot of people, they want to come back to where the Superfund site is. It's home. It's where they built their families. What would you say to people who have this feeling of why do you keep coming back to New Orleans and places like it?
Well, I think you answered it, because it's home. And I think a lot of currents, especially in America today, kind of trivialize or minimize what place means to people, to communities, what home means to people. But I think about, the experience, especially of people who descend from those who were enslaved, right? Especially in a place like New Orleans. You walk out your door and you go past a place where your ancestors beat the drum in the square. You go past a place where your grandfather played the trombone on the corner, where you had second lines that commemorated the lives and the deaths of every single person you knew. You go outside New Orleans, you think about a place like Princeville, the place where your name is on the streets, where the people, your grandparents dug their house out, where your family Bible is, where the only people who you've ever known are all laid to rest. What are we doing in this world if it's not for them? If it's not for that connection to place and who we are? So you can't make light of that. Obviously, we're in a situation now where some level of retreat is, going to be necessary. And that's just the nature of the beast, the thing that we have wrought. But I think we have to have those conversations with compassion. Have to think about how do we have those conversations while also making space for the sacred. I think we talked about earlier, as we introduced this thing, how do we live as ancestors? And how do you prescribe a policy that explicitly purports to take away that opportunity to live as an ancestor? So I think we really have to, it's really easy to go into this place and tell people, oh, this place is not going to be around, we're going to give you money to move, and you're not making sense if you don't want to take this package. It's easy to do that, and it completely belies, I talk a lot about Black history, but it's how humans have lived their lives as long as they've been human. It's what makes us human. It's where we bury our people. That is, the thing that anthropologically makes us human. And that's home. And why would you leave that?
Absolutely. Someone says, Katrina was the first time I personally saw celebrities become vocal about climate disaster in my lifetime. How did that play?
Kanye West, huh?
How did that play a role in the response of media and politicians?
So I was just having this conversation earlier today, and it was about Kanye West. I don't want to talk about Kanye in the present. It depresses me. But we included that clip where he said George Bush doesn't care about Black people, in Floodlines, because number one, for me as a teenager, seeing it on TV, it absolutely rocked my world. It's all we talked about in school the next day. It was huge. It was a very, whatever you believed about that moment, whatever you thought about whether George Bush did care about black people or not, whether you thought Kanye West was right or wrong, you talked about it. And I think about what that said about where we were, media-wise, in terms of the larger rhetoric around race and justice in this country, because I think about if a similarly positioned public figure today said anything about Joe Biden or Donald Trump today, it wouldn't make any news at all. We wouldn't think about it. You wouldn't talk about it the next day. It wouldn't be something that got, people were talking about whether the record label should drop Kanye West. That wouldn't happen today at all. And I think that actually really illustrates just how much the conversation in media about race has transformed. It's easy to take it for granted, but there's people now who go about, you hear the term white supremacy on CNN, which you would have never heard in 2005, unless you were talking about hooded Klansmen. And even then, I don't know. So I think really going back and looking at, celebrity has changed, obviously. We're in an era where I think the role of celebrities, they're asked to do a little more. They also have a little bit less of a footprint than they did before, and individually. And it really was kind of a blast from the past to think about how it worked during Katrina.
I kind of want to combine these two questions a little bit. How have you been able to navigate keeping your voice as a black man in journalism? And how do you feel about the idea of objectivity from that standpoint?
That's always a question I get. For one, I am what I tell people every day. Look, I get to ask people questions for a living. And there's no bigger blessing than that in a life. I get to do what I love. I get to learn about the world from other people, and I get paid for doing it. And that's remarkable. And I never want to throw that away. But also, I'm so blessed. Being so blessed, I think I have a duty to try to do the job the right way, in a way that edifies me, but also honors the people in the tradition who came before me. And I look at my predecessors in journalism, there's obviously people from mainstream outlets that I think I'm following in their footsteps. But if I'm thinking about the ancestors in black journalism specifically, I'm thinking about Ethel Payne, who was a longtime reporter for a couple black presses. I'm thinking about Ida B. Wells, who Ida B. Wells. I'm thinking about W.B. Du Bois, who we don't think of often as a journalist, but who built his name running the Crisis magazine reporting on lynching. And I think about the staff of the Chicago Defender, the staff of the Recorder, the staff of the Baltimore AFM. And you look at how they responded to events in the world, especially regarding black communities in the teeth of Jim Crow. They were not what we would call traditionally objective. They were people. You could not be objective about lynching as a black reporter in 1935. There was no way. I mean, you could have, but it would have been kind of silly. You couldn't be objective in the way we consider objectivity, traditionally considered today, as a black reporter for Ebony covering Emmett Till. And it would have been unreasonable to ask you to do so. So I think, but what they were rigorous. They always questioned their priors. They made sure that if they were going to talk to the people who were victimized about it, it was not just, being even-handed, but they had to understand the genesis of the problem. They had to go and find the Klansmen who were doing the lynching and ask them about it too. And again, they often did so at great personal risk. I think what they had was not objectivity, but something much greater. It was rigor. And so for me, I try to be rigorous. And that's all I can be. I think anything else, I do it as long as I can. And if people ask me to be any different, I've got other things. I can go back and farm maybe. I don't know.
Well, we have a place for you here. This is a great question, and good luck with it. How do you see the future of environmental journalism evolving and crossing political lines?
Oh, this is a great question. Shout out to whoever asked it. Well, environmental journalism exists, which is a thing that is, I think I wrote a story about environmental racism for the New Yorker in 2016 to 2017. And it was about the terminology of environmental racism, where it came from, where the environmental justice movement started, which, spoiler alert, it's in Eastern North Carolina, so it's a big deal for me. But I believe that was the third or fourth time either of those phrases had ever appeared in the New Yorker. That was 6 years ago. You have people, now you have whole places with environmental justice beats. You have places now that have climate reporters. You have entire climate news outlets. You have outlets that are focused on environmental and climate justice and how it's centered on communities of color, marginalized communities. Those are things that did not exist in a systematic way 5 to 10 years ago. And I think more and more newsrooms and outlets are realizing now that it's not just a silo you can put people in. It's going to be the material conditions of our lives. It is the material conditions of our lives. And it's going to be the center of politics in America in the next generation. So I do think there's going to be a major shift to this from being a beat that's largely siloed within, straight environmental reporting is often siloed within science and health and technology reporting. It's going to become a much more, the way, what we think of as political reporting, a lot of it migrated there from cultural reporting. So I think it's going to have that same type of migration to the center of our reporting. And it has to, because unfortunately for us and for the world, we're going to be in a place where these effects of climate change are not going to be ignorable in the same way.
It is also kind of nice to be, as an energy and environment reporter, to be in a newsroom with people who aren't, to be able to bring that lens to their work that maybe they never thought of before. Even on a city beat, I might say, I know they're developing that land, as you said. I think that's a brownfield site. That's something that I don't think that a lot of people would really think about. This might be a contaminated site.
Right.
So I think that that's also something that's kind of nice that we can bring to the table and maybe open up that beat a little bit.
Yeah, I try to tell people every day, you want to expand, you want to talk about environment broadly. It's about how you live. That's it. And that can encompass a lot of different things. And if you go back and talk about how all these pivotal moments in political history and such really revolved around environmental issues, it can help and change how people think about things. A lot of the major economic crises in America, those are fundamentally environmental issues. You think about, again, we talked about 1927. There's a great book called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson about the great migration of Black Americans. What a lot of people don't realize is that was kind of kicked off by a flood. It's environmental history. Yeah, it changes the way you think about things.
What's the follow-up to Floodlines, and do you have any podcast recommendations?
Oh, so I'll start with the recommendations because I'm a podcaster and I listen to every single podcast. And I get in the car with my kids and my 2-year-old daughter says, "No more podcasts." So, yeah, I'm a podcast guy. I'm one of those. I think one thing I would recommend based on what we're talking about is this brilliant show that I love called Scene on Radio. And they tackle a number of different issues, but they had a season recently about the origins of climate change in racial capitalism. Oh man, it's a banger. It's very good. Aside from that, let's see. I loved, unfortunately, we had to discontinue it. The Atlantic has a show called The Experiment. If you haven't listened to it, there's a bunch of episodes still online. It's an amazing show. Let's see. I'm also listening to this show from BBC called The Bomb. It's about, the first season is about the history of the atom bomb, the Manhattan Project. And the second season goes more into depth about after the dropping of the bomb, what happened with nuclear weapons in the world. Let's see, I love Throughline from NPR. Goodness, there's so many. There's so many good podcasts.
Too many podcasts.
Too many. Too many podcasts.
Or just the right amount.
There's This Land from Rebecca Nagel, which is about there's a case regarding the sovereignty of indigenous land nations in Oklahoma. And I think it tackles that case and then goes past that. And then from WNYC, there's this show called La Brega, which is about the sort of history, culture, and long-term trajectory of Puerto Rico. It's very good. And then another one from NPR called White Lies, in which a really intrepid pair of reporters basically kind of solve a cold case regarding the murder of a preacher in Alabama and during the Civil Rights Movement. So that's a pretty good selection, I think, of podcasts. And what I'm working on now, and this is, I've been given permission by the team to talk about it because I'm working on another podcast. And, when we finished Floodlines, we had to take a long time to think about, obviously a lot of life happened for me since then. But during then I was thinking about what about Floodlines, what about that approach was important to me, what changed my perspective, and what we could take from there and apply, what events we could apply a similar approach to and get, I think, similar new understandings of the world about. And I had a good 2 years in a pandemic in my basement to think about it. And the thing that kept coming back to me was I've done a lot of work that emanates from the civil rights movement, particularly what we consider the end of the civil rights movement. So I think a lot about the great rupture, and I think in history that I think about every day is I was taught in school that essentially, during the civil rights movement, black folks won. We did it. We got Civil Rights Act 1964. People went over the bridge in Selma. We got the Voting Rights Act. We won. We got school integration. We won that whole civil rights thing. We did it. But it's always been hard for me to square that with the fact that we traditionally date the end of the civil rights movement with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by a white supremacist. How is that possible that we won when this paragon of the movement was assassinated when he and the members of that movement believed they had so much more work on the table? And this podcast is about that. There it is.
Well, I think we're all going to look forward to it. So.
Thank you.
All right, can we thank Vann and Rebecca for that wonderful conversation? All right, thank you, Vann and Rebecca. Thanks to all of you for those wonderful questions, and we so appreciate you joining us this evening. We want to give one more big shout out to our partners at WFYI and Indiana Public Broadcasting News for making tonight possible. We want to thank again the Indianapolis Public Library for hosting us in their space, and we also want to thank our funders, the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. If you're looking to dig deeper into any of the topics you heard about tonight, the Indianapolis Public Library has curated amazing book lists and book displays out on your way out of the library this evening. I encourage you to check those out. And we hope that this evening's discussion has inspired you to engage with local journalism and that you can continue the conversation in your own communities. So with that, thank you. Have a great evening.